magazines. Please help me welcome Ed Phillips.
Good afternoon. How is everyone today? How's the volume back there? In good shape? Okay, very good. Thank you. Hi, Mary Nelson. This lady has been so instrumental in helping me over the last 30 years. Got to give her a little bit of recognition. She's been wonderful at WSU to help me out. So, Mary, thank you so much. Well, this afternoon we're going to take an informal tour and kind of a broad brush of Wichita. You folks cannot see, can you? Okay, I'll stand back here. Of Wichita as the air capital of the world and how it came about. And maybe you've thought of that. Isn't it interesting that this town on the prairie has turned into being what it is today? And it has such a wonderful, rich past and history and a legacy to share. So today I want to talk about some of the highlights of that and how the city got this way. And we'll talk about some of the debates on why it ended up being the air capital of the world, as a matter of fact. So let's proceed. We can go back, actually, to Wichita into the early 1900s when there was a few balloonists here. And that was kind of what sparked the interest of men like Jack Turner, who was a businessman here. And then in 1911, the Curtiss Exhibition Company came to town. And the Curtiss Exhibition Company was a number of pilots and airplanes built by Glenn Curtiss of Hammondsport, New York. And you may be familiar with that name, Curtiss. It was a very famous name in aviation, also in motorcycle technology as well. And the reason that he had an exhibition company that traveled the country was because Wilbur and Orville Wright, his competitors, had an exhibition company that traveled all over the nation also. So they were kind of direct competitors at that time. And if I just want to comment, this is certainly not a Wichita-built airplane. However, the men that flew these, in a word, were brave. Very brave. Because these were basically bamboo and wood and powered by pusher engines. And you can see the pilot there standing with a propeller. And if there was a crash, guess where the engine went? Yeah. Right into the pilot's back. And that happened quite a few times. So we'll see a little bit about how technology has improved with the engineering in Wichita over the decades as well. However, they came here to Wichita in 1911. They didn't make a lot of money. People weren't, the airplane's kind of an interesting gadget, but it'll pass. It's a fad. Well, it wasn't a fad, thank goodness. But nevertheless, they did come. And among those that came was Jimmy Ward and his new bride. Now, she was 15 years old, and she managed to get on the wing of this airplane. And she used to fly in the exhibitions with him on the wing. Now, if that isn't love at work, I don't know what is. And how about trust? But Jimmy Ward was a very well-known pilot. And he's holding the steering wheel, which is the way they did that back then. And anybody want to guess why? Why would they have a steering wheel instead of a stick? What do you drive? You drive a car, you drive a car. So there's some similarities there. Yeah, the transition's very easy. And you notice he has a football helmet on. I don't know what college he played for or anything like that. He had a football helmet on. And if you notice real close, this is interesting to me. He's got the coolant radiator behind his left shoulder and the engine back there. And the fuel tank's up real high, so it'll gravity feed the fuel down. They only had enough fuel to fly for 10 or 15 minutes. But next to his shoulders, you'll see a pad. And of course, he had the steering wheel, and the steering wheel was only to go up and down. If you want to turn, he had to lean this way or lean that way in order to operate the Curtiss elevators on the wing. So it was an early part of Wichita's history, and I think a very important one. And as for you ladies, Mrs. Ward, you notice down at the bottom, just above her, below her knees rather, is a belt. For obvious reason, you can't go flying with a dress on. So they simply put a belt around that, and that started a trend in Europe called hoop dresses. And the women had these dresses that were real tight around the bottom, just below their knees. And I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Maybe you ladies would appreciate that. If not, we'll proceed. Okay. I want to spend just a minute talking about this man. How many of you have heard of Jacob Melvin Mellonick? I would expect that. This man, of course, good old Jake, being an oil man, in my opinion, has been largely overlooked in this city for his contribution. Now, that is my opinion. That's not everybody's opinion. That's what I think as an historian. Without Mellendick, I don't think we would be here today. I'll go so far as to say that, because he had oil money, and more than that, he had a vision to build airplanes and turn them into transportation vehicles. That was important to him, and that's remarkable for the time. In 1990 is when he began to get these ideas. So Jake deserves a whole lot of credit, because from Jake, we have Walter Beech, we have Lloyd Stearman, and other pioneers that came to Wichita to work for him, and also Matty Laird, of whom you'll hear a bit about this morning, or this afternoon as well. So don't forget Jake. He's a very, very important man here in Wichita's history. In 1919, he was able to lure, in a nice way, Matty Laird from Chicago. Now, Matty was a self-taught designer and a self-taught pilot, and he built his first airplane when he was still in high school up in Chicago. He built it in the attic of his mother's house, and then they dismantled it and lowered it down to the street and put it together and took it out to the airport, and he learned to fly on his own. So Matty Laird is very, very important. Also, I would rank him right behind, second behind Mellendick, because Matty Laird was a brilliant designer and had an airplane that he had just designed in Chicago, but he had no money to build it and no place to build it. So when no one in Chicago would help him, he happened to be a friend of Dave Bach, who was a barnstormer from Oklahoma, who knew Laird, and he told Jake Mellendick, hey, I know this guy in Chicago that's got an airplane, and he's really good, but he can't build it. And Jake said, go get him to come down here. There was some negotiation back and forth, and in 1919, Laird did move down here. And he was just a young man at the time. I had the privilege of meeting him in 1982, shortly before he died, and asked him some very pertinent questions, of which I'll share with you later on. But Matty Laird, there's the real first entrepreneur in aviation who actually had an airplane that Jake Mellendick could fulfill his vision in building that. Now this is Matty outside of his mother's house, and there's his first airplane. All right, and this is pre-World War I at that time. And Matty's the one standing there with his hands folded. And he had some brothers and other people, so obviously it was quite an attraction in Chicago. This is not the airplane he wanted to build. This was years later. But when he was ready to come to Wichita, this is the airplane he had on paper, the famous Laird Swallow. And to give you a little background on that, they were able to bring him down here in downtown Wichita, right here, in a plant that used to build harvesters. He began to build the Swallow with a small crew. Now, this is Jake's dream, and it was being fulfilled. He was very happy about that, and he had no problem with the money. So Matty began to tool up, and he looked for woodworkers, and that wasn't too hard. You had cabinet makers, you had other people. They used a lot of wood in automobiles that were built here. So were able to lure the people there to downtown to help him with that project. The problem was this airplane was very expensive for 1919. $6,000 for a new Laird Swallow. We just finished World War I, and there were thousands of surplus trainers on the market for $500. And this airplane was only marginally superior in performance to the Curtiss Jenny or the old Standard, which were coming off, just hundreds of them laying around to be sold. However, it had one advantage, and that was the front cockpit held two people. Now you say, well, so what? Well, that was important because after the war, some of those men who fought the war, they didn't just turn to barnstorming, they also began to give joyrides. And people wanted to say, hey, you know what, I got to go from Wichita, I need to get over to Liberal, can you fly me? Yeah, I can fly you. Somebody else that wants to go with you? That's two people. Now, what's that do for the pocketbook? They can double the money, okay? So you see, money was involved in that too. So that second person that could sit in the front was really critical for the Laird Swallow. And the name of the airplane, at first name, I'll share with you, was anything but glamorous. It was the Laird Tractor. Now, when you think of a tractor, what do you think of? A farm implement, of course. But one here in Wichita who saw it fly in 1920, make his first flight, he said, there she goes, just like a swallow. And that's the old story. And I've never been able to disprove that, so it sticks. Right, we'll go with that. And Swallow was a nice name for an airplane like that. Now, the three-place open cockpit swallow, about 40 were sold between 1920 and 1925. It was a hard business to sell this airplane. Again, when you could have so many surplus airplanes readily available. Now you notice this is the Norse Motor Company, Motor Oil, from up north in Nebraska, if I remember correctly. And they bought two, and they promoted their products with it. And they also flew charter flights, air taxis, so to speak. And that was a tough business in those days because it was open cockpit, the exhaust fumes, the cold air, it didn't make a difference what it was, rain, snow, you were going to get your share of all that. But the airplane was very successful. Now, it's often said that this was the first commercial airplane built in the U.S. I would disagree with that. It was one of the first commercial aircraft built in the U.S. A lot of people fail to realize all across the country there were little shops that were taking the old World War I trainers, converting them over to 2 and 3 seats and selling them. So it's not exactly that. If you want to call it one of the first or early production commercial airplanes, that would be accurate. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that. So the Swallow was very successful. Up on North Hillside, I'm sure that up on North Hillside, this facility here, it's shown in the picture, is no longer there, unfortunately. But the LLOYD facility was up there on North Hillside Avenue in the early 1920s. They couldn't build the airplane in town anymore. It was just getting the demand. And Jake Mellendick, again, footed the bill to and unfortunately, it's pretty much smooth ground now up there, if you're familiar with that. That should have been a National Historic Site, in my opinion, because of what went on there with the Swallow. And you can see a couple of the airplanes parked there. Not only that, but it was one of Wichita's first airports. It was actually used for people coming in and out of transit flight, military airplanes, and others. Remember this, Walter Beech, Lloyd Carlton Stearman got their start there. And we'll talk about Clyde Cessna later if you're wondering what happened to Clyde. Now here we see Walter Herschel Beech, and Mr. Beech was a master engine mechanic during World War I. He was not a pilot. You'll see different versions of that, but the letters that are contained in the special collections that Mary helped me with, very clear, you know, that his officers during World War I, when he went in as a sergeant, he was a master engine mechanic. He already knew how to deal with engines because he had been a chauffeur in Minneapolis and took care of those big Packards and the Pace Arrows and Pierce Arrow cars. He knew engines. So they put him to work, went through training, and he took care of the engines there. However, he did learn to fly after the war in 1919 as a non-commissioned officer. So it's true he was a pilot, but not during the war. It was after the war. In 1922, he came to Wichita, and Jake Dick hired him. And as the story goes, and Mr. Laird told me that this story was correct, when Laird and another pilot were in California demonstrating a Swallow, Jake Mellendick hired Walter. Now Walter, I'll quote exactly what Mr. Laird said. I said, what was the experience level of Mr. Beech when he came? I hear different versions of that. And he said, well, Mr. Beech, when he came, was a pilot of, quote, very limited experience. And that's true. He had maybe 30, 40 hours flying in the Army. And then he was down in Arkansas City, where he did some flying with Pete Hill before the hangar burned down. That was the end of that. So he came up here looking for work. So Mr. Laird said he was very limited experience. However, he had a lot of promise. Well, while Mr. Laird was away, Walter crashed a Swallow in his first week he was at work. Now, that was a lot of money. However, he said, I'll pay back every penny, and he did, every single penny. And not only that, but he developed into a very competent pilot. And you see those trophies down there, that's proof of that. He had a very natural knack for airmanship. He understood the airplane, what it was telling him, and he made it do what he wanted to do. So aerobatics and things like that were a way to make money back then with those trophies. Winning aerobatic contests were very important. Winning races were very important. And the Swallow was a good airplane for doing that, although it wasn't the only one out there. I always liked this picture of Mr. Beech in his younger years, and very dapper. And Turned out that he was a demonstration pilot, and he did the majority of the hard work selling those airplanes. And he paid back every penny. I'll make sure I message that. That's important. Okay, in 1923, Matty Laird and Jake Mellendick had always been at odds. Very different personalities. Laird was go slow, go slow. Mellendick was full throttle. Spend the money, don't worry about it. That just got to the point where he said, I quit. He took 2 airplanes and some money, went back to Chicago, never came back here until 1982. So then steps in Stearman, who had been working at an architectural firm here in Wichita, and Mr. Laird did hire him as an assistant engineer. Now, his background was in architecture, but it wasn't too much far removed from airplanes. Airplanes are structure, and he understood that. So in 1924, Mr. Mellendick needed a new chief engineer. He told Lloyd, you've got it, okay? That's your office now. And he designed the new Swallow, which you see here in 1924. It was a vastly improved airplane over the old Swallow. It still carried 3 people, but you notice the engine's enclosed, which was not a first, by the way. Engines being enclosed go back before World War I. However, he did a nice job of cleaning it up, but for a small commercial airplane, that was quite a step forward. And the landing gear was simplified, and the man that you see standing in front of this is Earl Beech, B-E-A-C-H, no relation to Walter Beech, who was a local pilot that did a lot of flying for different companies. So the new Swallow was very successful, and Walter had a lot of his hand in that, along with Lloyd, about designing different aspects of the airplane. And again, it was successful, and he was able to begin to sell those. This is a later picture of Lloyd Stearman. Of course, he was just a young man, quite a junior to Walter when he came to work. This is a picture of him when he was at Lockheed. He was the president of Lockheed at one point and an engineer there, and worked on various of the jet fighters of the 50s and also spacecraft, believe it or not. He was very widely practiced. So we'll see more about him. I like this airplane. This is Jake Mellendick thinking ahead, a thinker, a visionary. He said, you know what? Matty was still there. He said, Matty, let's start an airline. Wait a minute. We're just building commercial airplanes, and this infancy, aviation was not in its infancy. It was almost not even on a board anywhere. He said, well, let's build an airliner, and we'll fly between Wichita and Kansas City. And we'll charge X amount of money. So why don't you design it? So Matty Laird did that. He designed this Laird limousine, and that's exactly what they called it. You could get 6 people in there. And you can see this is a stage photograph. The pilot is Walter Beech, sitting in the front cockpit. They went through 3 different types of engines to try and get the airplane to behave properly. And make a long story short, when it was on a flight one day in the south part of Wichita, it crashed because of the engine failure. And the pilot, whom I never been able to find out the name, but it was not Mr. Beech, called back to the office and said, what do you want to do with it? And Mr. Mellendick said, burn it. And they did. They actually stripped everything out of it and burned it where it sat. So that was the end of the airline. Never got a chance to go anywhere. Let me digress a little bit for Mr. Cessna. Some of you are saying, well, where's Clyde in all of this history of Wichita? He goes way back to 1911 when he went to Oklahoma City and saw the Moisant aviators fly. And as you know, there's always been this, I guess you could say, a debate and controversy that Cessna was a monoplane man, which means 1 wing. Walter Beech was a biplane man, which is 2 wings. Don't believe it. I've never found any evidence of that. Walter Beech was whatever was modern, whatever would sell. He was for technology. Mr. Cessna just thought that monoplanes looked better and performed better. They were very good friends, and I'm going to tell you in a little bit how good friends they were, because Cessna would have to rank 3rd. We have Mellendick, Laird, and Cessna in making Wichita the air capital of the world, and we'll see. This little airplane that he's standing next to was his, basically his crowning achievement. In 1917, he built here in Wichita the Comet. And you notice that there's a bit of a canopy on that. Can everybody see that? That also carried a passenger. Just 1, but it was a step forward. That was quite something for 1917. This is before we got in the war in the United States. After that, all civilian flying was banned. So Mr. Cessna did barnstorming in 1912, 1913, 1914. 1915, he came to Wichita in 1916 at the Jones Motor Company, which is a Coleman plant now, and built these different airplanes. So he was also interested, not in flying, like Jake, he wasn't interested in flying, he was interested in building airplanes. Mr. Cessna's dream was to go into manufacturing, not so much flying. And when I was researching some of the papers in the Beacon, he was telling some of the reporters one time after he'd flown, they wanted to know if he was going to continue to fly. And his quote was, now this exact words or not, I don't know, but he says, "No, the darn things scare me too much." So I thought, well, okay. But his dream was to build them. See more of him later. This is another view. I like this because it gives a beautiful view of Clyde when he was doing exhibition flying. He would go to fairs. Do you know he could make $400 if he could stay in the air for 8 minutes? That's a lot of money back then. Pre-war? Oh, wow. And anyway, he's got the nice aviator cap turned on backwards. Look at the propeller. Handmade by he and his brother Roy, Cessna. Hand carved. Now, they broke a lot of propellers, believe me. And they made sure that they said that. The engine behind it is a French design, an Anzani radial. And that was his favorite power plant because they were readily available. And so hand-carved propellers, but Clyde did a lot to promote aviation and got people here in the city very interested in it as a mode of transportation. What was he after? I want to build a factory. I want to build these airplanes. I want to sell them so people can fly them. That was his passion. In 1926, I'm going to give you a little transition. During the war years, nobody was flying, basically. And in 1922 or 23, Mr. Cessna actually bought a Swallow. A lot of people don't know that. He's a monoplane man. Well, he was a biplane man then because the Swallow was fine. He needed an airplane, so he wasn't building them anymore, and he just bought one from LLOYD. And DWANE Wallace, who many of you know, was one of those great entrepreneurs here in Wichita also. And he was mentioning the fact that his uncle used to give him a lot of rides in that Swallow, in that open cockpit Swallow. And that's where he got his interest in aviation, was sparked by flying around with his uncle Clyde. But in 1926, after Travel Air got started, and I'll fill you in a little bit, he asked Walter and Lloyd STEARMAN, who were his associates, I'd like to build a monoplane. Do you care? No, go ahead. He did it on his own money and on Douglas Avenue, his own time. And this is what he came up with. Nice monoplane idea. And it was carried 5 people. And in 5 minutes, you could convert it to an air ambulance. He had a lot of ideas about how to sell airplanes. And we'll talk about flying with that a little bit more. In 1927, he left Travel Air, and Mr. STEARMAN had already left, and that left Mr. in charge. And we'll pick up that story tomorrow if you're here for Travel Air. But in 1927, Mr. Cessna built a monoplane called the Phantom on the West Douglas. You'll notice it has no struts on the wings. This was critical to him. Now, there were other airplanes that what we call full cantilever. They had no supporting structure under the wings at all, like the previous airplane. So it wasn't a first, but it was a beautiful airplane built here in Wichita, for that matter. And Mr. Wallace remembers seeing it fly, actually being present when it was flown. And it has a big porthole in the door, and it would carry a couple of people. But different configuration. The pilot's sitting up in the front, out in the wind, but the passengers are enclosed. So you see these different trends all coming together here in Wichita. That was an important airplane. Now to patch you in with Mr. STEARMAN, he's in the center in this photo. In 1926, he left Travel Air to go to California, where the photograph was taken. And the man to his right was George Lyle, a businessman, an investor, and a World War I pilot. And to his left is Fred Hoyt, who was also a World War I Travel Air dealer and distributor. And the hangar behind him there it says some Travel Air planes. So he's a distributor. And Travel Air sold the airplanes to him, and he had customers in California. And what he said, and this story is correct, he said, "Lloyd, come on out here. There's all this money. We have all these people in Hollywood, and all they want the airplanes. Come on out here and we'll build airplanes." Okay. So he went out. And this is the first airplane they built, the STEARMAN C-1. Beautiful airplane. Again, if you just look at it, it has more advanced over the Swallow and the Travel Air, for that matter. But he was in business there for less than a year, and he had no problem finding customers. That was never the problem. Does anybody want to guess what the problem was? Money. He needed investors. And this is what aviation people have always run into. You have a great idea, but you need investors. And when investors get involved, they have their say in how it's done. But the designers, these men were such entrepreneurs. Cessna, Beech, LLOYD, STEARMAN, they knew what they wanted. They just had to figure out how to make it happen. So Mr. STEARMAN came back to Wichita, and we'll see what happened there when he did. He came to the old Coleman plant where Mr. Cessna had built his airplanes. You remember a few minutes ago. And they started STEARMAN there. And those buildings are still there, most of them. You can go up to them. And if you look at some of the photographs from the STEARMAN factory, everything still looks the same. There's just no equipment in there. So it's amazing that Wichita has these wonderful historic sites. They need to be preserved. They at least should be placarded as some type of an important place. And you've already lost LLOYD's at Swallow, unfortunately. But STEARMAN's still standing there. We still have the Travel Air Factory, and we still have the Cessna factory, even though it's a little hard to find them. So STEARMAN began up there in the northern part of Wichita. Here's the first airplane that we built here, a C-2B for Walter Varney. And this is a trim, nicely designed airplane. Shows Lloyd's continuing evolution of his design abilities. And it has a radial engine on it, and the pilot sitting in the back, very standard biplane. However, in front of him, this wasn't for passengers. This was carrying 500 pounds of mail, air mail. Walter Varney had the contract airmail route out in the northwestern U.S., and he bought STEARMAN's almost exclusively all the mail. So that's what that airplane was built for. And STEARMAN built a lot of those airplanes later on. Here's one by the 1930s, the Junior SPEEDMAIL. Again, a LLOYD design, excuse me, a STEARMAN design. Was probably the ultimate STEARMAN ever built. Beautiful airplane. There's still 3 flying in the United States. I don't believe there's any overseas. The Junior SPEEDMAIL is kind of the epitome. Oil companies use it to fly executives around the country. Texaco had some as well, which is what your Standard Oil Company of California had, those particular airplanes. So we'll talk a little more about Mr. STEARMAN, but very established company. In 1930, even after the Depression, or I shouldn't say Depression, but the debacle on Wall Street occurred the year before, the people who had acquired STEARMAN in the East decided to build a new factory. And they did. Now, some of you know that who eventually occupied all those buildings? Boeing, sure, okay. So Boeing got his foothold here through Lloyd STEARMAN and this particular factory. So that's what it looked like originally. Doesn't look like that now, of course. But as the 30s grew worse, as the Depression deepened, you couldn't sell biplanes anymore. STEARMANs were very difficult to move because they were expensive. The only people who could afford them were the airlines, if they had contract airmail routes, they could pay for them, or oil companies. Very few private pilots, or sportsman pilots, as they called them back then. However, they were able to refurbish other people's airplanes here, including some de Havilland airplanes for airmail. And so gradually, when the Boeing 247 came on the scene, in the mid-30s, they also built instrument panels and things like that for Boeing's airplanes. So Boeing used them as a subcontractor. That saved them. And we'll talk about the rest a little bit later. So this is down on Oliver. By the World War II, I think most everybody knows, this is probably what most people call a STEARMAN. Okay? And it's technically a Boeing STEARMAN, but nevertheless, the STEARMAN trained many, many, many pilots. And I wanted to mention something. In my research for the STEARMAN book, one of the generals, a 3- or 4-star general in charge of training in World War II, said in a letter that the STEARMANs were the toughest airplanes that they had for basic training. They just didn't break like the Fairchilds and some of the other airplanes did. And so they said they just kept cranking them out. So over 10,000 were built during the war. So again, Wichita was becoming more and more entrenched and known, even internationally, as a air capital. Now let's go to Travel Air for just a minute. If you're here tomorrow, I can go into much more detail. It's just giving you a touch here. The Travel Air Factory, by 1929, Walter Beech was president, and There were a number of other people there, but he's the main person at the moment in terms of management. We'll talk about Mrs. Beech shortly. And this shows the completed factory in 1929. It was a big facility. And you know what? This is amazing. But in 1929, before the crash, and after Lindbergh flew in what year? 27. That caused an aviation explosion. Anybody who had a garage and could build an airplane could sell it. It was almost that good. However, Travel Air was very well known and established. Their business took off very, very well, as a matter of fact. And the Travel Air records show that they had 600 men and women working out there in 1929, 3 shifts except for Sunday, trying to build 25 airplanes per week and couldn't meet demand. It's amazing. And it was wonderful from a profit standpoint, but it was very, very tough. So in 1929 and 28 and 29, to take care of increasing demand, they put on another building and another one, and then the center one. And if you ever get a chance to go out to what I still call the Beech Factory, and I always will call it the Beech Factory, if you go in, you can still find these buildings. They're there. You can even look on the floor and see little pieces of steel sticking out where some of the old equipment used to sit in the Travel Air plant. So there's a lot of legacy and heritage out there. That's for sure. Isn't that right, Harold?
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Okay. You notice the little building across the street is a hotel. This is Travel Air City. And they had so many workers coming in to help them build the airplanes, they had a place to put them. So there's a bunch of garages there and a little hotel for them to stay in. And you can't see it very well, but below and to the right of the water tower is a house. And that was the man who was in charge of overlooking the entire campus, strict security and taking care of mechanical problems and things of that nature that popped up. This plant was really, really busy in 1929. Okay, this is a very famous picture of Mr. Beech in 1925, and he's sitting in a racing airplane built by Travel Air, designed by Lloyd STEARMAN, called the Special. And it was an inline engine, and he won a lot of races with that, and you'll see some trophies out there to attest to that. It was one of his favorite airplanes, I want to mention too. And it was a trim, clipped wing, fairly powerful, 160 horsepower. In 1925, that was a lot. And he flew it in a lot of regional air meets, and also in the first Ford Air Tour, which was sponsored by Edsel Ford and his father, Henry. And that whole purpose was, by the mid-20s, everybody, aviation was becoming so big that it was time to promote it better than it had been. Because, you know, a lot of people looked at barnstormers and stunt pilots, and they thought, well, aviation's dangerous. The idea, Ford wanted to change that. And of course, he built his own airplane, the Ford Trimotor, which you're familiar with probably, at least know about. But Mr. Beech went there with this airplane and a couple of other Travel Airs and pilots, and they won different first place. And it was good public relations for them and helped sell airplanes. And that was his main job. He was interested in innovation. There's no question about that. He wanted to be, number one, wanted to be out in the leading edge of technology for aviation. I think that was his case all his life, but he also understood that it had to be done right. It had to be done correctly. So we'll see more about that. All right, now, let's go back to Clyde Cessna. In 1924, when Travel Air had just gotten started in downtown Wichita behind the Broadview Hotel, the building's not there anymore, Clyde Cessna was the president. They had only built a handful of airplanes. They needed somebody to take care of all the paperwork as the more and more paperwork and running the office. Well, Miss Olive Mellor, who had been working at Staley Electric out to the east, she applied for the job, and according to the best information I could come up with, she interviewed with Mr. Cessna, and he hired her. Okay? So he was hired by Clyde, went to work at that time, and she proved to be very efficient. Okay? Very efficient indeed. And I had the privilege of talking with Mrs. Beech a few times for interviews, asking her questions, am I right on this, am I wrong on that? And she straightened me out on a couple of them, but I'm very thankful for that. But nevertheless, she was an absolutely pivotal person in Travel Air to keep the company running. And we'll hear more about that tomorrow. And she liked polka dot dresses. This is another view of the office in 1928, which is now part of the Beech plant. And this is Beech, or Olive MELLOR, is on the right, and then Madge Edwards is in the center. I don't know if any of you ever knew Madge Edwards. And then Merle von Boskirk is over on the left, and she was one of the secretaries for Mr. Beech. But Miss MELLOR really ran that good. I have to wait till tomorrow to tell you a story. If you can come back, you can hear about a story that just amazes me when we were talking about it in one of our interviews. But you have to come back. All right. There's another picture of Mrs. Beech, or Olive Ann, excuse me, and June Meyer. June Meyer was handing Olive Ann a letter that she was to take up to the Detroit Air Show in that Travel Air back there. Now, I asked Mrs. Beech at that time, of course, I said, did you ever want to learn to fly? I was really curious about it. She says, no, Mr. Phillips, I really didn't. And did you like flying? Oh, yes. But Mr. Beech's idea of flying was to take me up and turn the airplane upside down. I'll never forget her saying that. She chuckled. But she liked flying, and she liked airplanes very much. And here she is with Art Goebel. And Art Goebel was the pilot who flew a Travel Air in 1927 in August all the way to Hawaii with William Davis as a navigator from the Navy. And they won the Dole Prize. Everybody eats Dole pineapple. That's where it came from. And Ray Brown, he's the salesman. And at this point, Art Goebel had a flight school in Kansas City. And he was buying, I think, half a dozen or a dozen Travel Airs for his flight school. And this is when things were still going strong in 29. So it was no problem selling airplanes, but Miss MELLOR made sure that was done correctly. And then in 1930, Olive Ann and Walter were married. And I thank Mary Lynn Oliver for this photograph, and it is really a good one. It's a wonderful photograph as well. Well, in 1930, with the Depression coming on, Travel Air had already been absorbed by an East Coast corporation, and Curtis Wright was part of that. You notice I said Curtis Wright? Well, the old squabble between Curtis and Wright, by the 1930s, after lawsuits that went on for years, the court ordered them to consolidate. So it became Curtis Wright. Very interesting. And it was a very famous company, a very well-known company. But Mr. Beech went to St. Louis, where he worked as a vice president, also in New York as well. All right, so in April 1932, we're making a jump here. You might call this the height of the Depression. Walter and Olive Ann Beech, in concert with aeronautical engineer Ted Wells. How many of you heard of Ted Wells? Okay, Ted's very important here. He's going to become one of our people. Launched the Beechcraft Company, Beech Aircraft Company, amidst the worst economic depression America had ever experienced. So the first airplane to bear the name Beechcraft was a Model 17 R1. It flew in November 1932 with Pete Hill at the controls. Pete Hill was a longtime friend of Mr. Beech, and it helped him get started in flying after the war, for that matter. And this is what the first airplane to bear the name Beechcraft looked like. However, this is in 1934 after it had been modified and sold to the ETHYL Oil Company. Again, who's buying the airplanes? Oil companies, people that could afford them. This was a bullish flying machine. Fantastic. 200 miles an hour. Whew. For a commercial airplane that could carry 4 people was almost unheard of. Even the military fighters were struggling to get to 200 miles per hour and land at 60 miles per hour. This is Ted Wells' creation. And to make a long story very short, when Ted Wells and Walter both went to St. Louis to work for Curtis Wright after Travel Air had been absorbed, in 1932, the Travel Air plant here was closed, locked up, everything sold, cleaned out. Well, they just stored some airplanes that they couldn't sell. Ted Wells said to Mr. Beech, they knew each other very well, I have a design. Do you think you can sell Curtis Wright Management to build it? And he says, I'll try. Curtis Wright Management said, no way. In a depression, we're not going to do that. We can't afford barely to keep the doors open now. That airplane would be very expensive. So Mr. Beech, and this is that entrepreneurial spirit, along with Mrs. Beech, and Ted Wells said, we'll just go back to Wichita and we'll start our own company. Now, that takes courage also. Now, fortunately, the financial means were there to do that if they were handled carefully. So they went back to Wichita, and let me just mention here that Mr. Beech began building his stagger wings in Clyde Cessna's factory. If you didn't know that, Clyde Cessna's factory had been locked up tight. And they were not building any airplanes. The whole place was vacant. And however, the board of directors, not Clyde, but the board of directors at that time kept it locked and were planning on just selling it. But they did lease one building to Mr. Beech, and he began to build the first Beechcrafts there, not at the Travel Air Factory. And this is some proof of that. This is the fifth stagger wing built that you see in the foreground there. And this is in one of those units at the Cessna factory. And if you look above, I know you're not all Cessna experts, and I don't claim to be either, but those are Cessna DC-6 fuselages hanging in the rafters up there, because there was no way they were ever going to build those airplanes. The place was locked up tight. But they were able to build this particular airplane, which we'll talk about in another presentation. If I'm ever able to do that, that'd be great. But further back was Ted Wells' new design for the stagger wing. Smaller a little bit, much more economical to build, much more economical to fly, and much more saleable in terms of price. Where these first stagger wings here were as much as $18,000 for an airplane. The new stagger wing would be $6,000, $7,000. And that's what saved that company in a large degree. And, but that's another story. In 1936, by this time, the Beech Aircraft Company was well established and was making a profit, doing well. And Louise Thaden, some of you may have heard of her, but she was a very well-known aviatrix. Walter got her started in aviation back in 1926. In 1927, he sent her out to California to work with D.C. Warren, who was a Travel Air distributor. She learned to fly. She was always hanging around the Travel Air factory, and the men didn't like that because she was asking them what they're doing. Can I help? Can I do this? No, get out of the way, that type of thing. So Walter finally said, if you're that interested, I'll help you. So he did. So he was instrumental in getting her started in aviation. In 1936, the airplane behind her, a C-17R Beechcraft, she and Blanche Noyes flew that from New York to LA and won the Bendix Trophy. An astounding accomplishment, because this was a race dominated by men. Had been since 1930, 31. But they won, and they did it in a stock Beechcraft except for an extra oil tank and an extra fuel tank. And they made the flight in, I want to think it was 14 hours, 55 minutes, and 1 second. And when they landed, they thought that they had done something wrong because a bunch of people were running after them trying to get them to stop. You know, and so she said to Blanche, the co-pilot, she says, roll the window down, see what's the matter. What we do, land the wrong way? Is the tail gear, something wrong with the airplane falling apart? That's what she says in her book. And they said, you've won the Bendix, you've won the Bendix. And they looked at each other and went, yeah, right. Okay, let's just go to bed, we're tired. They didn't believe it. But they did win it. And they only won the women's division, but they won the whole race. And a total of nearly $10,000. An astounding thing. The first women to achieve that. And guess who suggested to Mr. Beech that he let her fly it? Olive Ann. She was very progressive, and she believed women had a role in aviation, and rightly so, and she knew Louise very well. So she has her to thank for that. I like this photograph. This is a great shot. In 1936 at the Denver Air Races, it shows a stagger wing that was probably flown up there, along with the company demo pilot, Mr. Beech and Mrs. Beech there, at the Mile High Air Races, of which the stagger wing competed in successfully, and also got the airplane out into the public's view. And also like this photograph, it's very candid. It was taken in 1937 when Mr. Beech, usually he was often seen out in the factory talking to people. He understood people. He understood. He wanted to make sure that they understood that he understood them, that they worked hard, and he expected a lot from them. There's no question or doubt about that. But he had every right to. Building the best airplanes in the world, that was his passion. But occasionally, from what I was able to learn, they would come to him in the office and say, Mr. Beech, we're backed up. Can you do a couple of test flights? Sure. So he put his pipe down for a few minutes. You notice he still got that pipe, and ubiquitous pipe, and a parachute, and go out and do a complete test flight. He's president of the company. But that's just the way he was. Anything that they needed, he would help them out. And that was a great, great thing. And this is also a very famous photograph. You may have seen this at some time in the past, but it's a picture of Mrs. Beech with a UC-43 in 1944. The stagger wings were all built, but during World War II, they were built at what used to be Plant 2. Some of you know that just recently been demolished, sadly. Has quite a history. You could write a book on the history of that building, believe me, the different companies that were there. But anyway, this is a good shot of her during the war. And the UC-43 was built down in that particular factory. Went to the British and other different allies during the war, mainly for liaison. They also flew in the Pacific. And they would use a stagger wing and sometimes a twin Beech, depending. When the U.S. Navy was island hopping, you know, fighter pilots were okay to fight, but they weren't greatest navigators in the world to go over the Pacific Ocean. So they would have a well-equipped airplane such as this and a good navigator on board, plus the pilot, and they would lead the fighters to the next base. Okay, and they'd take that, when the next island down the line was done, they'd lead them there. So they're talking about some overwater flights of 300 and 400 miles, and there's nothing but water. So you needed a guide plane, and that's what they used them for, among other things. And then Walter Beech and DWANE Wallace, a very well-known photograph, but it shows the twin Beech on the left and the C-34 Airmaster on the right. And again, in those 4 interviews that I was able to have with Mr. Wallace were invaluable in filling in gaps in Wichita's aviation history as he remembered it. Okay? So the story of how they were able to wrest the company out of the hands of the board of directors, he and his brother Dwight, in 1934, they were able to do that and start building the Airmaster. That is a very unique story. But he and Mr. Beech were friends, and Mrs. Beech too. They were competitors, yes, but they were allies. Allies in what? This is the air capital of the world. This is aviation. We're in this together. We may be competing against each other, but we are in this together. And so they were always friends. And Mr. Wallace told me repeatedly how much he respected Mr. and Mrs. Beech, for sure. All right, so the air capital of the world and the peerless princess of the prairie, the city that put wings on dreams. And that is my capsule history of Wichita, the air capital of the world. Thank you. I would be glad to entertain any questions. If I can't answer them, I'll get an answer and get it to Eric, and he will get it to you. So does anybody have any questions? I mean, this is, you could spend a week here. Yes, sir.
How did STEARMAN aircraft evolve into Boeing?
Okay. Yeah, well, eventually STEARMAN was acquired by Boeing,
Right.
okay, under a corporate umbrella. And so therefore they owned them as a subsidiary, and gradually began to shift more and more work down here because they had a nice facility and they hired a lot of people back to do it. And then, as you know, it just ballooned into the B-17 work. There was some B-17 work done there. They built very few new airplanes at that time, but they refurbished a lot of other people's airplanes. They built instrument panels for different competitors at that time, just to keep the place alive. It was really, really crucial. And then by the time the war was coming, they had already begun to build the STEARMAN trainers, and that was their bread and butter. So gradually they became to build the B-29, you know, and that's a fascinating story, how that worked. But if you wonder what happened to Mr. STEARMAN, I can mention that since you asked. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and say that. When he left Travel Air, of course, he went to California, then he came back here, and then when STEARMAN, during the Depression, he left and went back to California, and he and a couple other brave souls bought Lockheed, which was bankrupt. Everybody's familiar with Lockheed, the Blackbird and all that type of thing. They bought that company, and he had already begun designing what would eventually be the Electra. Now, everybody thinks of Amelia Earhart with the Electra, but that was really Lloyd Stearman's design when he was here in town, but no longer working for STEARMAN or United Aircraft or Boeing. So I just want to mention that. He deserves some credit for that.
Now that was a turboprop, right?
No, it's just a twin engine piston.
Oh, it was.
Looked a lot like a Beech 18 in a way, okay? But it was a different size airplane entirely. But a really nice design. It became very popular. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Ed, I know that during the 20s, there were many small aircraft factories sprung up beyond the ones you focused on.
Oh, of course.
Can you talk a little bit about those and what happened and why?
Well, many of them, there were more than, I think it was more than 20 plus aircraft factories or companies, startups here in Wichita. And it was bad timing, I think, is one of them. No sooner did they get started and the Wall Street debacle happens, and what do you got to have to build airplanes? Money, and there wasn't any, and they just collapsed. They just fell on their face. That's a good question. Yeah, and there were some good designs too, but so many people were trying to get into that business at that time. Did I see another hand? Yes, sir.
Excuse me, I think I listened to the introduction, but are you a pilot, an engineer, or a history teacher? Or all three?
I'm a pilot. I am a pilot and a flight instructor. I am a teacher. I am not an engineer, but I'm a very avid person. I guess you could call me an amateur historian, but I'm just very avid passion for this city and all that it's done for aviation in many ways, especially at the roots, at the root level. They should not be forgotten.
Thank you.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
have two questions. What would be today the address on North Hillside? And secondly,
That's a good question.
from whence did they get their materials to build the airplanes?
Okay. A lot of the airplanes, of course, were built of spruce, and that came from the Northwest, so they were able to ship it down here. You bring up a point. May I digress just a second? People say, well, why Wichita? And they say, oh, it was the location, because it was central, and it is kind of central in the country. I don't think that was it. And they said, oh, it was oil and wheat. And oil was big here, wheat was big here. And I said, well, yeah, that provided the money. But what made this city the air capital of the world was Mellendick, Laird, Cessna, Beech, STEARMAN, all being in the right place at the right time. That's what I think. It was the people that made it work. And thankfully it did. What was your second question, or did I miss that?
For today, what would be the address on North Hillside?
I do not know. I would have to. It's way up there. Yes, it is.
Further north?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a cemetery. It's still there.
It's north of 23rd Street.
Hi, John.
No, there's a long building which was used by a church recently,
Okay.
which was the hangar when that field became University Airport. Immediately north of that, there's a brick wall, and about 12 years ago, the STEARMAN factory was demolished at that point.
Okay.
So it's between about 22nd and 23rd Street on the west side of the street.
Okay, good answer. That's John Davis, by the way, who also knows a great deal. He and Walt House. Is Walt here? Okay. I don't think so. All right. Any other questions? Did that answer your question, ma'am?
Well, so the planes are all built out of birch?
Spruce. Spruce for the wings.
Wood,
Yeah, and
no
then,
metal.
yes, steel tube for the fuselage, which was welded together, okay, with gas welding, which is a very delicate art to do that, because it's very thin walled, almost paper thin. You could burn through it. But hiring skilled workers to do the welding and those to do the woodworking, that's how you built airplanes back then. All the way up until the advent of the mid-30s, when the aluminum industry began to take over, because airplanes were going faster and faster and faster. And what was holding them back was the technology. The engine was there, but the airframe needed to get a little mature with it. So you know how it is with progress. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us more about Mullendick? You said that he's been largely forgotten. I read somewhere that he pretty much died penniless.
That is true. I say he has been overlooked, is the word I like to use, because without him, without that vision he had, after the war he realized the value of the airplane, because he used it to fly out to his oil rigs. Now that was a war surplus airplane. However, he said, you know, there's potential to be done here. There's a business I could have here. How do I get that started? And fortunately, Billy Brock was one of the pilots that worked for him, and Billy Brock was an Oklahoma barnstormer, and that's when he said, well, I know a guy in Chicago. And that's just, one thing leads to another, and it's fascinating how you can continue to trace the history of this industry here. Did that answer your question? Okay, all right. Anybody else? Yeah, Harold.
And you might be interested in Newton. Lockheed 10A is being reconstructed, and it's ready to fly. It's almost, they haven't tested the engines and that sort of thing.
Wow.
They'll be stored and sent to Europe.
Okay.
And, next spring, they had a certain date, I don't remember what the date was, May the 30th or something like that.
Okay, that's very good. Yeah, that's a beautiful airplane,
And
indeed.
it has quite a history, because there's a shoe factory in Czechoslovakia, and that's famous. They made a lot of money. They bought this and they flew it around Europe, and then, well, to make a long story short, it ended up in the United States and got in poor condition. And one of the relatives of that shoe factory said, go find it and rebuild it. And so that's what they did. They found it down in
That's,
Texas.
that's great. Thanks for sharing that story. That's a good one. Yes, ma'am.
Have you written about the 1911 air show?
Only in an article quite a few years ago about it. The people who were sponsoring it were really hoping to make some money, but the gate receipts fell far short of that. And the Curtis Exhibition Company wasn't happy about it, and they didn't really pursue that any further. But that's the trouble Mr. Cessna had too, was to get people to come out to see him, you know, and that's a entirely different story. But yes, but there's not a whole lot written on that 1911 Air Meet, but it is significant in the sense that people got to see an airplane, many of them for the first time. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the travel air factories are still intact within Beech's Plant 1. Are the Cessna buildings still intact?
Yes.
Over on Fontaine?
Yes, they are largely there. That's correct. Yep. Good question. Someone else had a hand, I think? In front.
What's happened to the BD-5 and the BD-5J that they're building in Newton?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the answer for that. You know, maybe we can talk afterward, but I'm not familiar with that. I know what you're talking about, the airplane-wise, but I don't know if it'll be revived or not. I'm not really sure. Good question. Someone else? Yes?
Tomorrow's presentation, will you talk more about Dwayne Wallace and his contribution to
Well, no, I really won't, because we're emphasizing more of Travel Air and Walter Beech and Olive Ann Beach more or less this time. I have a complete program on that, but I will be injecting some of the comments he gave me where they are appropriate to support that story. But to answer your question is no, not directly. Not unless Eric is brave enough to have me come back sometime in the future, and we can do that.
But you mentioned that you interviewed, I think, Dwayne
4 times, yes.
So there will be a lot of...
Yeah, they were very difficult. Does anyone remember Bob Pickett? Knew Bob Pickett? Bob was the man, very briefly here, Bob was the man who finally convinced Dwayne and Velma that I was okay to talk to. So he said, well, who is this guy? And so when I went in and met him, and he's sitting behind that desk in Fourth National Bank, and he said to me, Mr. Phillips, I want to make something very clear. I take care, I direct the interview, not you. I said, yes, sir, whatever you say. And he said, now, you know, I'm going to tell you the truth, and this truth might cause some controversy. And I said, bring it on, fine. We just want to tell the truth. What happened in this city? How did you guys get that company back? You know, what's going on? So anyway, enough of that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
You might have mentioned this, but weren't Dwight and Dwayne Wallace nephews of Clyde Cessna?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And
They were both, by the way, you mentioned the Fourth National Bank. At one time, they were both directors of the Fourth National Bank.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Mr. Wallace's story.
40 years.
Yeah, that's right. Mr. Wallace's story could be put into a book. I mean, it's a very interesting story, just on what he did, he and Dwight, to get that company going again. And the fact that Mr. Cessna had pretty much washed his hands of aviation by that time for a particular reason. But he did agree to help them and sign the letters asking everybody to turn over your stock to these guys, you know, and open up the company again, open up the doors. So he did that, but he never really was an active participant in the industry anymore. Yes, ma'am.
I will tell you this, that 50 years ago when I got my pilot's license, it was 4 times harder for a woman to get it than it was for a man.
Ah, yes.
I mean, we had to go through everything, not once or twice. But
Well,
I got it all right.
Congratulations to you for doing that. That's wonderful. That's great. Any other questions? Okay, Eric, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Have a seat.
Well, we hope to see you tomorrow, and I hope that you'll stay around and enjoy some refreshments and look at the museum. Thanks for coming.
Okay, does that sound all right to you? Yeah. I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed this.